The morning sun cast golden rays across the sprawling grounds of Rideau Hall in Ottawa, where two small figures stood at the tall windows of their temporary residence. Prince George, 9 years old with sandy brown hair that refused to stay perfectly combed despite his nanny's best efforts, pressed his face against the cool glass. Beside him, his younger sister, Princess Charlotte, 7 years old with long brown hair tied back in a neat ponytail, stood on her tiptoes to get a better view of the Canadian landscape that had become their home for the past 2 weeks. Their first royal tour to Canada had been unlike anything either child had experienced before. The vast country with its endless forests, towering mountains, and crystal-clear lakes had captured their imaginations in ways that no amount of schoolroom geography lessons could have prepared them for. George had spent hours sketching the wildlife they had encountered, from the majestic moose they spotted during their visit to Jasper National Park to the playful seals they watched during their coastal excursion in British Columbia. Charlotte had filled 3 entire journals with her observations, writing in her careful handwriting about everything from the taste of maple syrup straight from the source to the sound of French being spoken in the streets of Quebec City. Her mother, the Princess of Wales, had encouraged both children to document their experiences, knowing that this trip would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The tour had officially begun 3 weeks earlier when their aircraft touched down at Toronto International Airport. The children had been nervous but excited, clutching their small carry-on bags that contained their most precious possessions for the journey. George had packed his favorite book about Canadian wildlife, while Charlotte had brought along her collection of colored pencils and a special notebook her grandmother had given her specifically for this trip. Their father, Prince William, had prepared them extensively for what to expect. He had shown them photographs from his own visits to Canada, explained the protocol they would need to follow, and most importantly, helped them understand the significance of their presence in the country. Canada held a special place in the royal family's heart, and William wanted his children to understand and appreciate the strong bonds between the Canadian people and the British monarchy. The first few days had been overwhelming. Everywhere they went, crowds of people lined the streets, waving flags and cheering. George had initially found the attention intimidating, staying close to his parents and speaking in whispers when addressed by officials. Charlotte, however, had quickly adapted to the public attention, smiling brightly and even attempting a few words in French when they visited French-speaking communities. Their itinerary had been carefully planned to showcase the diversity of Canada, while ensuring the children could handle the physical and emotional demands of royal duties. They visited children's hospitals where George and Charlotte played games with young patients, their natural warmth and genuine interest bringing smiles to faces that had seen too much suffering for such young ages. These visits had perhaps affected the royal children most deeply, as they began to understand the responsibility that would one day rest on their shoulders. In Toronto, they had visited a maple syrup farm where both children got to participate in the traditional process of collecting sap, and watching it transform into the golden syrup Canada was famous for. George had been fascinated by the scientific process, asking detailed questions about temperatures and timing that impressed the farm's owner. Charlotte had been more interested in the taste-testing portion of the visit, declaring Canadian maple syrup far superior to anything they had back home in England. Their visit to Falls had been a highlight that neither child would ever forget. Standing behind the thundering water, feeling the mist on their faces, both George and Charlotte had been struck silent by the raw power and beauty of nature. William had watched his children experience this wonder, remembering his own first visit to the falls years earlier. The family had taken numerous photographs, with Charlotte insisting on taking some with her own small camera that had been a gift from her grandfather, King Charles. The children had also experienced Canadian winter sports for the first time. At a rink in Montreal, they had attempted ice skating, with Charlotte showing a natural grace that reminded observers of her mother's athletic abilities. George had been more cautious initially, but had eventually gained confidence, even managing a few simple hockey moves taught to him by local children who had been invited to skate with the royal family. Their cultural education had been extensive. They had visited museums where they learned about Indigenous Canadian history, with both children showing deep respect and interest in the stories shared by Indigenous elders. George had been particularly moved by stories of traditional hunting and survival techniques, while Charlotte had been fascinated by the intricate beadwork and traditional clothing displayed in the exhibits. The language barrier had provided some amusing moments. In Quebec, Charlotte had attempted to order her lunch in French, resulting in some confusion but lots of laughter from the restaurant staff who had been charmed by her effort. George had been more reserved with the French language, but had surprised everyone by successfully giving a short thank you speech in French at a formal dinner, having practiced diligently with a tutor in the days leading up to the event. Their accommodation throughout the tour had varied, from luxury hotels in major cities to more modest but comfortable lodges in remote areas. Both children had adapted well to the changing environments, with Charlotte particularly enjoying the rustic cabin they had stayed in during their visit to the Rocky Mountains. She had declared it much more exciting than their rooms at Kensington Palace, though she admitted she missed her own bed and toys. The outdoor adventures had been numerous and thrilling. They had gone whale watching off the coast of British Columbia, where Charlotte had squealed with delight at seeing orcas breaching near their boat. George had maintained his composure better, but had filled several pages of his journal with detailed observations about the whales' behavior and the marine ecosystem they had witnessed. Hiking in Banff National Park had challenged both children physically, but they had risen to the occasion, completing a moderate trail with their parents and security detail. The views from the mountaintop had rendered them speechless, and both had insisted on sitting quietly for several minutes, simply taking in the majesty of the Canadian Rockies stretching endlessly in all directions. Their interactions with Canadian children had been particularly meaningful. At schools they visited, George and Charlotte had participated in regular classroom activities, from mathematics lessons to art projects. Their teachers back home had coordinated with Canadian educators to ensure the children wouldn't fall behind in their studies while traveling. Both royal children had excelled in these settings, demonstrating the quality of their education and their natural intelligence. Charlotte had formed a special friendship with a young girl named Emma at a school in Vancouver. The two had bonded over their shared love of horses, and Emma had taught Charlotte some Canadian folk songs during their lunch break. The friendship had continued through carefully supervised correspondence, with Charlotte writing letters about her continued travels and Emma responding with updates about life in Vancouver. George had been equally engaged, particularly enjoying a science demonstration at a Montreal school where students were studying weather patterns. His thoughtful questions and genuine interest had impressed both teachers and students, and he had requested additional reading materials about meteorology to take back to England. The security arrangements had been extensive but discreet, allowing the children to have relatively normal experiences while ensuring their safety. The Canadian authorities had worked closely with British security services to create an environment where George and Charlotte could interact naturally with Canadian citizens while remaining protected. Both children had gradually become accustomed to the constant presence of security personnel, though Charlotte had initially been concerned about whether the officers ever got to have fun. Food had been another adventure entirely. Beyond the famous maple syrup, both children had tried poutine for the first time, with George declaring it surprisingly delicious, despite its unusual appearance. Charlotte had been more adventurous with local cuisines, eagerly trying everything from butter tarts too. Their parents had been pleased to see their children's willingness to embrace new experiences, knowing that such openness would serve them well in their future royal duties. The wildlife encounters had been extraordinary. In addition to the whales and seals, they had seen black bears from a safe distance during a supervised nature walk, observed eagles soaring overhead during a boat trip, and had even spotted a family of deer grazing peacefully near their lodge one morning. George had started a wildlife photography hobby during the trip, using a child-friendly camera to capture images of the animals they encountered. Weather had provided its own challenges and delights. They had experienced everything from warm, sunny days perfect for outdoor activities to sudden rainstorms that required quick changes of plans. A surprise snowfall during their visit to the Yukon had thrilled both children, who had built snowmen and engaged in snowball fights with local children who had been invited to join them. The educational aspect of their tour had been carefully balanced with fun activities. Museum visits had been followed by playground time, formal dinners had been balanced with casual meals, and official ceremonies had been interspersed with opportunities for the children to simply be children. Their tutors had accompanied them on the trip, ensuring that their regular lessons continued, but adapting the curriculum to incorporate their Canadian experiences. As their time in Canada drew to a close, both George and Charlotte had developed a deep affection for the country and its people. They had collected souvenirs not just for themselves, but for friends and family back home, carefully selecting items that represented the different regions they had visited. Charlotte had chosen a small Inuit carving from their northern excursion, while George had selected a book of Canadian wildlife photography that captured many of the animals they had seen during their adventures. Their parents had watched with pride as their children had grown and matured during the tour. Both William and had seen their children develop greater confidence in public situations, deeper appreciation for different cultures, and stronger understanding of their future roles as members of the royal family. The trip had been as much about personal growth as it had been about diplomatic relations. The morning of their final week in Canada arrived with a mixture of excitement and melancholy that seemed to hang in the air like the early autumn mist over the Ottawa River. Prince George woke early, as had become his habit during their stay in Canada, and quietly made his way to the window seat that had become his favorite spot for morning reflection. The view across the grounds of Rideau Hall had become familiar and comforting, and he found himself trying to memorize every detail of the landscape that had become so dear to him. Princess Charlotte was already awake when George passed her room, sitting cross-legged on her bed with her collection of Canadian souvenirs spread around her like treasures from a grand adventure. She had been organizing and reorganizing her mementos each morning, trying to decide which stories she would tell first when she returned home to her friends at school. The small carved wooden beaver that an indigenous artist had given her in Winnipeg sat prominently among her treasures, alongside pressed flowers from their prairie adventure and a small vial of sand from a Prince Edward Island beach. Their parents had noticed the change in both children as their departure date approached. William and had observed their son and daughter becoming more reflective, more aware of the significance of their experiences, and more reluctant to let go of the connections they had formed. The royal couple had discussed extending their stay, but ultimately decided that maintaining the planned schedule would be best for everyone involved, including their Canadian hosts who had been incredibly generous with their time and resources. The previous day had been filled with final visits and farewell ceremonies. At the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, both children had participated in a special presentation about the relationship between Britain and Canada throughout history. George had been particularly fascinated by the artifacts from early British settlements, while Charlotte had been drawn to the displays showing the evolution of Canadian culture and traditions. During their museum visit, they had met with a group of young Canadian historians who had prepared a special presentation about the role of the British monarchy in Canadian history. The young people, ranging in age from 12 to 16, had impressed both royal children with their knowledge and passion for history. George had asked several thoughtful questions about the constitutional monarchy system, demonstrating an understanding of government that surprised the adults present. Charlotte had been more interested in the personal stories behind the historical facts. She had listened intently as one young historian described the experiences of early British settlers, particularly the women and children who had made the difficult journey across the Atlantic Ocean to build new lives in Canada. Her empathy and emotional intelligence had been evident as she responded to these stories with genuine concern and interest. Their final school visit had taken place at college in Ottawa, where they had spent an entire day participating in regular classes alongside Canadian students. George had joined a mathematics class where students were working on problems related to calculating distances across Canada, a perfect blend of education and their travel experiences. He had worked collaboratively with his Canadian classmates, showing none of the privilege or entitlement that some might have expected from a future king. Charlotte had participated in a creative writing workshop where students were composing stories about Canadian adventures. Her story, about a young girl who befriended a family of loons on a northern lake, had impressed both her teacher and classmates with its vivid imagery and emotional depth. The teacher had asked permission to include Charlotte's story in the school's literary magazine, a request that had pleased the young princess immensely. During lunch at the school, both royal children had sat with their Canadian peers, engaging in conversations about everything from favorite books to dreams for the future. Several students had asked George about what it was like to know he would one day be king, and his thoughtful, honest responses had revealed a young person who was beginning to understand the weight of his future responsibilities while still maintaining the natural curiosity of childhood. The afternoon had included a special ceremony where the school presented both George and Charlotte with honorary certificates of friendship, recognizing their participation in school activities and their contributions to cultural exchange. The certificates would join their growing collection of mementos from their Canadian adventure, each one representing a meaningful connection they had formed during their visit. Their cultural immersion had continued with a visit to a traditional Indigenous powwow in the region. Both children had been honored with invitations to participate in certain ceremonial activities appropriate for their ages and status as visitors. George had been particularly moved by the drumming and traditional songs, while Charlotte had been fascinated by the intricate designs of the traditional regalia worn by the dancers. An elder of the local First Nation had spent time with both children, sharing stories about the connection between the land and the people who had lived there for thousands of years. George had listened with the intense concentration he typically reserved for subjects that truly captured his interest, asking questions about traditional hunting techniques and seasonal migration patterns that demonstrated his growing appreciation for Indigenous knowledge and wisdom. Charlotte had been especially drawn to the stories about the role of women in traditional Indigenous society, learning about the respect accorded to women as life-givers and decision-makers in many Indigenous communities. The elder had gifted Charlotte with a small traditional ornament, explaining its significance and asking her to remember the stories she had heard whenever she looked at it. The powwow experience had been transformative for both children, providing them with a deeper understanding of Canadian diversity and the importance of respecting and preserving Indigenous cultures. Their parents had been proud to see their children engaging respectfully and thoughtfully with traditions that were both ancient and living, recognizing the value of this cultural education for their future roles as representatives of the monarchy. Their penultimate day had included a private tour of the Parliament buildings, where they had been given special access to areas normally restricted to the public. In the Senate chamber, both children had been invited to sit in the historic chairs and learn about how Canadian democracy functioned. George had been fascinated by the parliamentary system, comparing it to what he had learned about the British Parliament and asking questions about the similarities and differences. Charlotte had been more interested in the human stories behind the political processes, wanting to know about the people who had served in Parliament and the decisions they had made that affected ordinary Canadians. Her questions had revealed a natural inclination toward understanding how government actions impacted real people's lives, a quality that would serve her well in any future public service role. They had also visited the Prime Minister's office, where they had been given a brief meeting with Canada's leader. The Prime Minister had been gracious and welcoming, taking time to speak with both children about their experiences in Canada and their impressions of the country. George had thanked the Prime Minister for the hospitality shown to his family, while Charlotte had shared her favorite memories from their tour. The conversation had been informal and comfortable, with the Prime Minister asking about their school subjects and interests outside of their royal duties. Both children had spoken about their love of outdoor activities, their enjoyment of learning about different cultures, and their gratitude for the kindness shown to them by Canadians throughout their visit. The Prime Minister had been impressed by their maturity and genuine warmth. During their final weekend in Canada, the family had enjoyed some private time together, away from official duties and public appearances. They had taken a quiet boat trip on the Ottawa River, where both children had reflected on their experiences and shared their thoughts about returning home. George had expressed his desire to continue learning about Canada and perhaps return someday to explore regions they hadn't had time to visit. Charlotte had talked about the friends she had made and her hope that she could maintain some of these relationships despite the distance. Her parents had assured her that appropriate arrangements could be made for her to stay in touch with some of the children she had met, understanding the importance of these connections for their daughter's development and happiness. The boat trip had also provided an opportunity for family photographs in a more relaxed setting than their official portraits. William had taken numerous candid shots of his children enjoying their final moments on Canadian waters, knowing these images would become precious family memories in the years to come. Their final official event had been a reception at Rideau Hall, where they had said goodbye to many of the Canadian officials, dignitaries, and new friends who had made their visit so special. Both children had prepared short farewell speeches, which they had delivered with confidence and genuine emotion. George had thanked the Canadian people for their warm welcome and expressed his hope that the friendship between Britain and Canada would continue to grow stronger. Charlotte had focused her remarks on the personal connections she had made, thanking the children who had played with her, the teachers who had welcomed her into their classrooms, and all the adults who had taken time to share their knowledge and stories with her. Her speech had brought tears to the eyes of several adults in attendance, moved by her sincerity and the genuine affection she had developed for Canada and its people. The reception had continued late into the evening, with both children staying up past their usual bedtime to ensure they could say proper goodbyes to everyone who had been important to their Canadian experience. Their parents had made exceptions to their normal routine, recognizing the significance of these final moments and their children's desire to honor the relationships they had built. As they prepared for bed that final night at Rideau Hall, both George and Charlotte had spent extra time packing their belongings, carefully wrapping their souvenirs and organizing their journals and photographs. Charlotte had asked her mother to help her write thank-you notes to several of the children she had met, wanting to ensure they knew how much their friendship had meant to her. George had spent time reviewing his wildlife photographs and sketches, creating a comprehensive record of all the animals they had encountered during their tour. He had decided to create a presentation about Canadian wildlife to share with his classmates back home, hoping to inspire their interest in conservation and the natural world. The departure day dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant autumn sunshine that had characterized many of their days in Canada. Prince George was awake before his alarm, having spent much of the night thinking about everything they would be leaving behind. He dressed quietly in his travel clothes, a smart navy suit that his mother had selected for their official departure, and made his way to the breakfast room where the family would share their final meal on Canadian soil. Princess Charlotte appeared shortly after, having taken extra care with her appearance for their farewell. She wore a burgundy dress with a maple leaf brooch that had been a gift from the Governor-General, a thoughtful touch that showed her growing understanding of diplomatic gestures and their symbolic importance. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she carried herself with a confidence that had grown significantly during their weeks in Canada. The breakfast conversation was subdued but warm, with both children sharing their final thoughts about their Canadian adventure. George spoke about how the vast landscapes had changed his perspective on geography and made him want to learn more about other countries around the world. He had already asked his tutors to include more international studies in his curriculum, inspired by his first-hand experience of how much there was to learn beyond the borders of Britain. Charlotte talked about the people she would miss most, particularly the children who had welcomed her so warmly at every school and event they had attended. She had been surprised by how easily she had made friends despite the formal nature of many of their encounters, and she had gained confidence in her ability to connect with people from different backgrounds and cultures. Their parents listened with pride as their children demonstrated the maturity and wisdom they had gained during their time in Canada. William and had hoped the tour would be educational and enriching for George and Charlotte, but they had been pleasantly surprised by how much their children had grown personally and emotionally during their visit. The experience had exceeded their highest expectations. After breakfast, the family took a final walk around the grounds of Rideau Hall, with both children wanting to visit their favorite spots one more time. George returned to the small pond where he had spent many mornings watching Canadian geese and other waterfowl, adding final sketches to his nature journal. The detail in his drawings had improved significantly during their stay, reflecting his growing skills as an observer of the natural world. Charlotte made her way to the garden area where she had played with local children during several informal gatherings. She had developed a particular fondness for a climbing tree that had provided the perfect spot for quiet conversations and shared secrets with her new Canadian friends. She left a small note tucked into the tree's bark, a message of thanks and friendship that might be discovered by future young visitors to the residence. The packing process had been completed the previous evening, but both children wanted to double-check their belongings to ensure they hadn't forgotten any of their precious Canadian mementos. George carefully examined his collection of pressed leaves from different Canadian provinces, each one labeled with the location where he had found it and the date of their visit. His methodical approach to collecting and organizing reflected his naturally scientific mind and his desire to remember every detail of their journey. Charlotte reviewed her extensive collection of photographs, both official portraits and candid shots she had taken with her own camera. She had become quite skilled at photography during their tour, and some of her images captured perspectives that even the professional photographers had missed. Her artistic eye and natural curiosity had combined to create a unique visual record of their Canadian experience. The official departure ceremony began at mid-morning, with Canadian dignitaries gathering to bid farewell to the royal family. Both George and Charlotte had prepared final remarks, having worked with their parents to craft messages that would properly convey their gratitude while reflecting their own genuine feelings about their Canadian adventure. George's speech focused on the lessons he had learned about leadership and service through observing Canadian officials and community leaders during their visit. He spoke about how meeting mayors, teachers, healthcare workers, and volunteers had shown him different ways that people could serve their communities and make positive differences in other people's lives. His words reflected a young person beginning to understand the many forms that service could take. Charlotte's farewell address was more personal and emotional, expressing her deep appreciation for the friendships she had formed and the kindness shown to her by Canadians of all ages. She spoke about how the children she had met had taught her new games, shared their favorite books, and shown her different ways of looking at the world. Her speech was delivered with genuine warmth that touched everyone present. The ceremony included the presentation of final gifts, with Canadian officials offering beautiful items that would serve as permanent reminders of their visit. George received a hand-carved canoe paddle made by an Indigenous artist, complete with traditional designs that told the story of water travel across the Canadian landscape. The artist had explained each symbol during the presentation, and George had listened intently, showing deep respect for the cultural significance of the gift. Charlotte was presented with a collection of books by Canadian authors, carefully selected to represent the diversity of Canadian literature and the variety of stories that emerged from different regions and cultural communities. The collection included both classic works and contemporary stories, ensuring that Charlotte would continue learning about Canada long after her return to Britain. Both children also received official certificates of honorary Canadian citizenship, a rare honor that recognized their contributions to strengthening the relationship between Canada and Britain. The certificates were beautifully designed and would be framed for display in their rooms at Kensington Palace, serving as daily reminders of their Canadian experience and the responsibilities that came with their royal status. The media presence was significant but respectfully managed, with photographers and journalists documenting the farewell ceremony while maintaining appropriate distance from the family. Both George and Charlotte had become comfortable with media attention during their tour, learning how to interact naturally while being photographed and understanding their role in creating positive public relations between their countries. Canadian television networks were providing live coverage of their departure, and both children waved enthusiastically to the cameras, understanding that many of their Canadian friends would be watching from across the country. Charlotte blew kisses toward the cameras, a spontaneous gesture that perfectly captured her natural warmth and the genuine affection she had developed for the Canadian people. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police provided a ceremonial honor guard for their departure, with officers in their iconic red serge uniforms creating an impressive visual tribute to the visiting royal family. George had been particularly fascinated by the RCMP throughout their tour, asking detailed questions about their training, their horses, and their role in Canadian law enforcement and ceremonial functions. During their tour, both children had been given opportunities to interact with RCMP officers in informal settings, learning about their daily work and the pride they took in serving Canada. George had even been allowed to briefly ride one of the ceremonial horses under careful supervision, an experience that had thrilled him and added to his growing appreciation for equestrian activities. As their departure time approached, both children took final moments to say personal goodbyes to staff members who had become special to them during their stay. Charlotte hugged the housekeeping staff who had ensured her room was always comfortable and had listened patiently to her excited recounting of each day's adventures. Her natural empathy had led her to develop genuine relationships with people in all roles, regardless of their official status. George thanked the security personnel who had kept them safe while allowing them to have authentic experiences throughout their tour. He had developed a particular friendship with one officer who shared his interest in photography and had taught him techniques for capturing wildlife images. The officer had been impressed by George's natural talent and his serious approach to learning new skills. The Governor General delivered final remarks praising both children for their grace, curiosity, and genuine engagement throughout their visit. The official noted how George and Charlotte had represented their family and their country with dignity while remaining authentically themselves, a balance that many adults struggled to achieve in similar circumstances. The farewell ceremony concluded with the playing of both the Canadian and British national anthems, with both children standing respectfully and singing along when appropriate. Charlotte had made an effort to learn some of the words to "O Canada" during their visit, and her attempt to sing along was noticed and appreciated by the Canadian officials present. Their motorcade to the airport was lined with Canadian well-wishers who had gathered to bid them farewell. Both George and Charlotte pressed their faces to the car windows, waving enthusiastically and trying to make eye contact with as many people as possible. The genuine warmth of their responses to the crowd demonstrated that they had truly connected with the Canadian people during their visit. At several points along the route, the motorcade slowed to allow for better interaction with the crowd, and both children were able to see familiar faces among the well-wishers. Charlotte spotted several children from schools they had visited, and her excited recognition of these friends showed how meaningful these connections had become to her. The airport farewell was necessarily brief, but no less emotional than the earlier ceremony. Canadian Prime Minister and other senior officials were present to offer final thanks and to express hope for future visits. Both George and Charlotte promised to continue learning about Canada and to maintain the friendships they had formed during their stay. As they prepared to board their aircraft, both children turned for final waves to the Canadian delegation and the media representatives who had covered their tour. Charlotte's wave was enthusiastic and joyful, while George's was more reserved but equally genuine. Their different personalities had been evident throughout their tour, yet both had found ways to connect authentically with the Canadian people. The aircraft steps seemed symbolic of their transition from Canadian visitors back to British royals, but both children carried with them memories, friendships, and lessons that would influence them for the rest of their lives. Their Canadian adventure was ending, but its impact would continue to shape their understanding of their roles, their world, and themselves. The royal aircraft sat gleaming on the tarmac at Ottawa International Airport, its presence marking the end of what had been the most significant journey of young Prince George and Princess Charlotte's lives. Both children stood at the base of the aircraft steps, taking final looks around the Canadian landscape that had become so familiar and dear to them over the past few weeks. The autumn air carried a crispness that reminded them of their mountain adventures and lakeside explorations. Prince George held his carefully packed camera bag, which now contained hundreds of photographs documenting their Canadian experiences. Throughout their tour, he had developed a genuine passion for photography, particularly wildlife photography, and his collection included images of everything from majestic elk in the Rockies to colorful autumn leaves in eastern Canada. His technical skills had improved dramatically under the guidance of professional photographers who had accompanied their tour, and several of his shots were worthy of publication. Princess Charlotte clutched a special folder containing letters and drawings from Canadian children they had met throughout their journey. Each piece of correspondence was precious to her, representing the friendships and connections that had made their tour so meaningful. She had promised to write back to many of her new friends, and her parents had assured her that arrangements would be made to maintain these relationships despite the distance between Canada and Britain. Their boarding was delayed briefly to allow for final media photographs and interviews. Both children had become comfortable with press interactions during their tour, learning how to be natural and authentic while still maintaining appropriate royal protocol. George answered questions about his favorite memories with thoughtful consideration, mentioning his wildlife encounters and the impressive natural landscapes they had explored. Charlotte's responses were more emotionally expressive, talking enthusiastically about the friends she had made and the new things she had learned about Canadian culture and history. Her genuine excitement and affection for Canada were evident in every word, and her interviews would later be praised for their warmth and sincerity. The Canadian media had been charmed by both children throughout their tour, noting their good manners, natural curiosity, and evident enjoyment of their Canadian adventure. As they finally climbed the aircraft steps, both children turned for one last wave to the Canadian delegation and the crowds of well-wishers who had gathered to see them off. The moment was captured by dozens of photographers, creating images that would become iconic representations of the successful royal tour. Charlotte blew kisses to the crowd, while George offered a more restrained but equally heartfelt wave, their different personalities still evident even in this formal departure. Inside the aircraft, both children were quiet initially, processing the emotions of leaving a place that had become special to them. The plane's interior was configured for royal travel, with comfortable seating and spaces for both work and relaxation during the long flight back to Britain. Their parents had arranged for the children to have activities and entertainment for the journey, but both George and Charlotte seemed more interested in reflecting on their experiences than in being distracted from them. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Charlotte pressed her face to the window, watching the Canadian landscape pass below them. She could see the Ottawa River where they had taken their final family boat trip, and the familiar landmarks around Rideau Hall where they had stayed during their final week. The view from above gave her a different perspective on the places that had become so familiar and meaningful during their ground-level explorations. George spent the takeoff period organizing his notes and photographs, beginning the process of creating a comprehensive record of their Canadian adventure. His methodical approach to documentation had impressed the adults throughout their tour, and his travel journal had become a detailed chronicle of not just what they had done, but what they had learned and how they had grown during their time in Canada. The first hour of flight was spent in family conversation, with both children sharing their immediate reactions to leaving Canada and their thoughts about returning home. William encouraged their children to express their feelings openly, understanding that processing this experience would be important for their emotional development and their future understanding of their royal responsibilities. Charlotte talked about missing the friends she had made, particularly Emma from Vancouver, with whom she had bonded over their shared love of horses and adventure stories. She had already begun planning letters to send to Emma and other Canadian friends, wanting to maintain these connections and share news about her life back in Britain. Her parents were pleased to see how genuinely attached she had become to people she had met during their tour. George discussed his plans to continue learning about Canadian geography, wildlife, and history after their return home. He had already asked his tutors to incorporate more Canadian content into his studies, and he wanted to research the animals they had observed to learn more about their behavior and habitat requirements. His scientific curiosity had been strongly stimulated by their Canadian experiences. Both children talked about wanting to return to Canada someday, either as part of future royal duties or simply as visitors who wanted to explore regions they hadn't had time to visit during this tour. Their parents explained that such return visits were indeed possible and likely, given the strong relationship between Britain and Canada and the importance of maintaining those connections through personal relationships. The flight attendants, who were experienced in serving the royal family during international travel, had prepared special meals featuring some of the Canadian foods the children had particularly enjoyed during their tour. Charlotte was delighted to discover that maple syrup was available for her pancakes, while George appreciated the inclusion of some of the local fruits they had tried during their prairie visits. During the meal service, both children shared stories with the flight crew about their Canadian adventures, their natural enthusiasm making the flight feel more like a family journey than a formal royal transport. The crew members, many of whom had Canadian connections themselves, enjoyed hearing about the children's experiences and were impressed by their detailed knowledge of Canadian geography and culture. As the flight progressed across the Atlantic, both children settled into different activities that reflected their personalities and interests. George continued working on his travel documentation, writing detailed descriptions to accompany his photographs and sketches. His goal was to create a presentation that he could share with classmates and friends back home, hoping to inspire their interest in Canada and in international travel generally. Charlotte spent time creating thank you cards for many of the people who had been special to them during their tour. Her artistic skills, which had been nurtured throughout their Canadian adventure, were evident in the careful drawings and decorations she added to each card. She wanted each recipient to receive something personal that showed her genuine appreciation for their kindness and hospitality. The children also spent time reading books about Canada that had been gifts from various hosts during their tour. George was particularly absorbed in a detailed guide to Canadian wildlife that included information about animal behavior and conservation efforts. Charlotte was enjoying a collection of Canadian children's stories that helped her understand different aspects of Canadian culture and regional differences. Their parents used some of the flight time to discuss with their children how they would share their Canadian experiences with friends, family, and the media back home. Both George and Charlotte would be expected to give some interviews and perhaps make presentations about their tour, and their parents wanted to ensure they felt comfortable and prepared for these responsibilities. The conversation also covered the importance of maintaining the relationships they had built in Canada and the ways they could continue to support Canadian causes and organizations from Britain. Both children expressed interest in staying connected to some of the charities and schools they had visited, understanding that their royal status gave them opportunities to make positive differences in people's lives. As they flew over the Atlantic Ocean, Charlotte asked thoughtful questions about the history of travel between Britain and Canada, wanting to understand how their ancestors had made similar journeys in earlier centuries. Her questions led to impromptu history lessons about early British settlement in Canada and the development of the special relationship between the two countries. George was more focused on the technical aspects of their journey, asking about flight routes, time zones, and the logistics of international travel for royal family members. His interest in these details reflected his growing understanding of the complexity involved in royal duties and the careful planning required for successful international visits. Both children expressed gratitude to their parents for including them in such an important and meaningful tour. They understood that not all royal children were given such opportunities at their young ages, and they appreciated the trust their parents had shown in them by including them in official diplomatic activities. Their mature responses demonstrated how much they had grown during their Canadian adventure. The flight also provided time for the family to begin processing some of the more significant lessons and insights from their tour. Both children had been exposed to different approaches to education, different cultural perspectives, and different ways of living, and their parents wanted to help them understand and integrate these experiences into their worldview. Charlotte talked about being surprised by how similar children were around the world, despite differences in language, culture, and living situations. Her observations about the universal nature of childhood friendship and play showed a developing understanding of human nature that would serve her well in future royal duties. George reflected on the diversity he had observed within Canada itself, from urban centers to wilderness areas, from indigenous communities to immigrant populations. His growing appreciation for complexity and nuance in social and cultural matters impressed his parents and suggested he was developing the kind of sophisticated understanding that would be essential for his future role as king. As their aircraft began its approach to British airspace, both children experienced mixed emotions about their homecoming. They were excited to see their familiar surroundings and to reunite with friends and extended family members, but they also felt sadness about leaving Canada behind and uncertainty about when they might return to the country that had captured their hearts so completely. The familiar green countryside of England appeared below their aircraft as they approached London, a sight that brought mixed emotions to both Prince George and Princess Charlotte. While they felt excitement about returning to their beloved home at Kensington Palace, they also experienced a profound sense of loss as their Canadian adventure officially came to an end. The rolling hills and neat fields of the English landscape looked almost impossibly small and tidy, compared to the vast wilderness expanses they had grown accustomed to during their weeks in Canada. Princess Charlotte pressed her nose against the aircraft window one final time, watching the Thames River wind through London toward their destination. She had done the same thing when they departed weeks earlier, but now she was returning as a young person transformed by her experiences. The confident, worldly girl looking down at London bore little resemblance to the excited but nervous child who had left England for her first major royal tour. Prince George was already organizing his belongings in preparation for landing, his methodical nature ensuring that nothing would be forgotten or left behind. His camera bag, journals, and collection of Canadian souvenirs were carefully packed and accounted for, representing not just memories, but also educational materials that would continue to enrich his understanding long after their return home. The landing at RAF was smooth and efficient, with the familiar procedures of royal homecoming providing a stark contrast to the excitement and uncertainty of their departure weeks earlier. British officials and security personnel greeted them with the professionalism they expected, but both children found themselves missing the warmth and enthusiasm they had experienced from Canadian crowds throughout their tour. Their motorcade journey from the airport to Kensington Palace took them through familiar London neighborhoods that seemed both comfortingly familiar and somehow smaller than they remembered. Charlotte pointed out landmarks and favorite spots to her parents, but her commentary was subdued compared to her usual animated observations. The transition from the vast Canadian landscapes to the more confined urban environment of London required some adjustment. George remained quiet during the drive, processing his thoughts and emotions about their homecoming. His natural tendency toward reflection had been enhanced during their Canadian tour, and he needed time to think through everything they had experienced before he would be ready to share his insights with others. His parents respected his need for this processing time. At Kensington Palace, their familiar rooms awaited them, but both children found their personal spaces felt different somehow. The rooms seemed smaller, more confined, and less connected to the natural world than the accommodations they had enjoyed in Canada. Their Canadian souvenirs looked somewhat out of place among their English belongings, representing two different worlds that they were now trying to integrate. Charlotte immediately began arranging her Canadian mementos around her room, wanting to keep her Canadian experiences visible and present in her daily environment. The small Indigenous carving found a place of honor on her bedside table, while her collection of pressed Canadian flowers was carefully displayed near her window. Each item had a story and represented a connection that she was determined to maintain. George set up a special corner of his room as a Canadian research area, where he could continue studying the wildlife guides, maps, and reference books he had collected during their tour. His Canadian wildlife photographs were organized in albums that he planned to share with friends and classmates, and his detailed journals were ready to serve as reference materials for future projects and presentations. Their first evening back in London included a quiet family dinner where both children shared their immediate impressions of being home. The familiar foods and comfortable surroundings were appreciated, but both George and Charlotte talked about missing certain aspects of their Canadian experience. Charlotte particularly missed the sense of adventure and discovery that had characterized each day of their tour, while George missed the constant opportunities to learn about new environments and ecosystems. Their parents listened carefully to their children's reflections, understanding that this transition period was crucial for helping George and Charlotte integrate their Canadian experiences into their ongoing development. William and Had expected that their children would be changed by their tour, but they were impressed by the depth and maturity of their responses to returning home. The following days brought a series of welcome home activities and obligations that helped ease their transition back to British life. Both children had interviews scheduled with British media outlets that had covered their tour, and they needed to prepare presentations for various organizations and schools that had supported their Canadian visit. Charlotte's first major post-tour engagement was with a group of British who had followed their Canadian adventure through social media and news reports. Her presentation about Canadian culture and the friends she had made was enthusiastic and engaging, demonstrating her natural ability to connect with audiences and share her experiences effectively. The children in her audience were fascinated by her stories and asked thoughtful questions that showed they had been genuinely interested in her Canadian journey. George's first presentation was to a gathering of young naturalists and wildlife enthusiasts, where he shared his Canadian wildlife photography and discussed the conservation challenges facing Canadian ecosystems. His detailed knowledge and passionate advocacy for wildlife protection impressed the adult organizers and inspired several young people in his audience to pursue their own interests in conservation and environmental protection. Both presentations were well received and demonstrated that the children had not only enjoyed their Canadian tour, but had also learned lessons that they could effectively share with others. Their parents were proud to see their children taking on these public responsibilities with confidence and genuine enthusiasm. School resumption required some adjustments, as both children needed to catch up on lessons they had missed during their Canadian tour. However, their tutors quickly discovered that their Canadian experiences had enhanced rather than hindered their educational progress. George's geography knowledge had expanded exponentially, Charlotte's cultural awareness had deepened significantly, and both children showed improved confidence in public speaking and social interaction. Their Canadian friends remained very much in their thoughts and daily conversations. Charlotte had already begun her promised correspondence with Emma in Vancouver and several other Canadian children she had befriended. Her letters were filled with descriptions of English life and questions about her friends' ongoing activities, maintaining the connections that had become so important to her. George had established communication with some of the young Canadian naturalists and historians he had met during their tour. His correspondence was more focused on sharing information about British wildlife and historical sites, creating educational exchanges that benefited young people in both countries. His systematic approach to maintaining these relationships reflected his growing understanding of diplomatic and cultural connections. Both children had requested that their ongoing education include more Canadian content, and their tutors had developed special curriculum modules that allowed them to continue learning about Canadian geography, history, culture, and current affairs. This enhanced education served the dual purpose of maintaining their connection to Canada while deepening their understanding of international relations and cultural diversity. The impact of their Canadian tour became evident in their daily activities and interests. Charlotte had developed a new appreciation for outdoor activities and had asked for riding lessons that would allow her to explore the British countryside more adventurously. Her Canadian experiences had awakened a love of nature and physical challenge that complemented her existing interests in arts and literature. George had become more environmentally conscious and had begun advocating for conservation projects around Kensington Palace and other royal properties. His Canadian wildlife encounters had inspired a passion for protecting natural habitats and endangered species that his parents encouraged through connections with British conservation organizations. Both children had also developed a deeper appreciation for cultural diversity and had asked to learn more about the various communities within Britain itself. Their Canadian experiences with Indigenous peoples, French-speaking communities, and immigrant populations had opened their eyes to the richness that comes from cultural variety, and they wanted to apply this understanding to their own country. Their changed perspectives were noticed by teachers, friends, and family members who observed greater confidence, maturity, and curiosity in both children. The tour had achieved its goals of providing educational and diplomatic benefits while also contributing significantly to their personal development and preparation for future royal responsibilities. As weeks passed, both George and Charlotte settled into their post-Canada routines while maintaining strong connections to their Canadian experiences. Their rooms remained decorated with Canadian mementos. Their conversations frequently included references to Canadian friends and adventures, and their future plans often mentioned hopes for returning to Canada someday. The success of their Canadian tour was measured not just in diplomatic terms or media coverage, but in the genuine personal growth and lasting connections that both children had achieved. They had represented their family and their country with distinction while remaining authentically themselves, and they had formed friendships and gained experiences that would influence them throughout their lives. Their Canadian adventure was officially over, but its impact would continue to shape their understanding of their roles, their world, and themselves for years to come. Prince George and Princess Charlotte had bid farewell to Canada, but Canada would remain forever in their hearts, minds, and memories as the place where they had taken their first major steps toward becoming the thoughtful, engaged, and internationally minded young royals their country and the world needed them to be. The bonds formed during their tour created lasting connections that transcended geographical boundaries and formal diplomatic relationships, establishing personal foundations for the continued friendship between Britain and Canada that would endure long into the future through the next generation of royal family members.